Joining me now here on the magic of Skype is a gentleman who called the fights at UFC Singapore. He is just my favorite analyst out there doing it right now, the one and only Dan Hardy. Dan joins us. Hey, there he is. Hi, Dan.
Hi, good to see you, man. You look great in that seat. Congratulations on the new show, man. It's good
Thank
to see you there.
Well, you know what? I can think of nobody better to join me but you. You've been very kind to me over the years, and I've really appreciated your analysis, and you did a great job at UFC Singapore. My first question is, are you still in Singapore? And if you're home, how the hell did you get there so fast?
Yeah, I got home. I landed at 5 o'clock this morning, so I've been back in the UK for 12 hours. But my adrenaline's still going from the weekend. I don't sleep a great deal for a few days after the fights because I'm still too excited.
Man, well, your enthusiasm shows. Great job calling that. Always love hearing you and John Gooden. Let's start at the top. I don't know if you heard my remarks about Donald Cerrone at all, but just this acceptance. It's not merely, it's all the character traits you can talk about being a good fighter, but then he doesn't have the responsibility. But to talk in the language that he has responsibility to the next generation, it is so utterly remarkable, is it not?
It's incredible. You know, he has my utmost respect, and you know, it's the true attitude of a martial artist. Take on any challenge, willing to learn from any challenge, willing to to go anywhere to take on a challenge, and embrace no matter what comes in his direction. I think it's incredible. I think a lot of fighters are inspired by him, and I got the I got the chance to speak to Jason Knight before UFC Liverpool as well, and he spent some time at the BMF ranch and just had nothing but amazing things to say about Cowboy. He does a lot for the younger generation of fighters, both inside the sport and outside. You know, teaching them how to change tires and tile roofs and that kind of stuff. Yeah, he's a great example to us all.
So if I had to ask you why Leon Edwards won the fight against Donald Cerrone, what would you say?
I would say he got a good head start. I would say he landed clean shots early on, and I think obviously he opened Cowboy up pretty good with a knee early on. I felt like he was, to a certain extent, dictating the fight, at least for the first 3 rounds. The problem with Leon Edwards is he tends to take the foot off the gas a little bit if he's cruising. He always reminds me of an old teammate of mine, Andre Winner, who, when he feels comfortable in the fight, he fights at the level that he needs to continue winning. And sometimes you know that he's got an extra gear and he can step it up. And a lot of the time, we watch Leon Edwards fight and he kind of starts slow and he builds up and looks great in the 3rd round like he did against Peter Sabota. But Cowboy, he started a bit faster, but then, he dropped off a little bit in the later rounds. But in his defense, it was the first time he's done 5 rounds.
Who won the clinch battle in your mind over the course of the 5? And what I mean by that is... sorry if I may, I'm sorry to cut you off. What I mean by that is not merely who was able to land the more effective strikes, but from a wrestling standpoint, control position, turn the other guy, that kind of thing.
Well, it's a great question, and I actually spoke about the Robbie Lawler fight for Cowboy, and one thing that he did really well in that fight, because he knew that Robbie Lawler was focusing on that kick to the body, and that is a weakness of Cowboy we've seen a couple of times. Cowboy started to level change into the clinch, and then he was coming up with knees and elbows and following up with a kick. But if you watch that fight back, every time they broke the clinch, they were breaking on Cowboy's terms, which was allowing him to land clean elbows. But for me in this fight, he was initiating the clinch, but not with the intention of getting a takedown, with the intention of maybe stifling the action a little bit. But then he was holding on for too long. And it was actually Leon Edwards that was breaking and landing the clean shot. So although obviously Cowboy was initiating the clinch a lot, I don't think he did a great deal with it. And it was always, the majority of the time it was Leon Edwards breaking on his terms and landing good shots.
What did you like the most from Leon Edwards? I would say in a vacuum, and all this have to be set up over time and things like that. But I would say in a vacuum, the body kicks were so quick. My only complaint was he didn't follow up on them enough. But if you had to ask me what I love from him, those were just sublime.
They were good. But if you go back and watch his Vicente Luque fight, I think that if Cowboy had faced the Leon Edwards that Vicente Luque fought, I think Leon Edwards would have probably been able to get the stoppage from the body kicks. I felt like he was better at setting up the body kicks in that fight. He used his lead hand much better to open up the body kick target. And to be honest, the best thing from Leon Edwards this week has been his attitude. We've seen more of his personality. He was very vocal in every face-off he had with Cowboy. He did get under his skin. He did rile him up a little bit, and I do feel like that affected the fight. We don't see a great deal of personality from Leon Edwards. He's a very quietly spoken fighter. But to me, I think that was the best thing we saw about him this weekend, was he kind of came out of his shell a little bit. And I think that now he's got this win over Cowboy, he's going to get a lot more confidence, that we're going to see in the future.
How would you, how do I ask this question exactly? It's not a question of merely who should be next for him, because that's a bit of a matchmaker role, but against who would he show his best talents next? Does that make sense? Like, not meritocratically, who has he earned a shot against? Who would he have to fight for us to see the very, very best of Leon Edwards? Because I felt we got flashes of it, and then not so much flashes of it.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of options. One fighter that he called out in his post-fight interview, Jorge Masvidal, would be a great fight. He's always been one of my favorites, and Masvidal's the kind of fighter that will push Leon Edwards back. He will look to expose Leon's slow start in nature, and I think he's a very aggressive kickboxer, very accomplished, and I think he can give Leon Edwards all that he can handle in that range, which I think will be a great fight. And the other one is Santiago Ponzinibbio. I think that would be a great matchup as well. Two very aggressive, fast strikers. Obviously, Ponzinibbio is much more of a push-forward fighter, and Leon Edwards is much more of a, wait for the fight to come to him and then punish them for it. So I think that would be a great matchup as well. But to be honest, I mean, pretty much everybody apart from Damian Maia and Kamaru Usman would probably be good fights for Leon Edwards at this point.
Fair point. Let's talk about Ovin St. Preux. He made a point in his comments to you post-fight that I never had taken inventory of, that he is so active and he'll fight anyone, anywhere. Listen to this, Dan. You already know this, but for the audience's sake, he joined the UFC in 2013. He fought twice in 2013. He fought 4 times in 2014, twice in 2015, 3 times in 2016, 3 more times in 2017, and he's already fought twice in 2018. Why does he not get credit for being an absolute, first of all, road warrior, and then a guy who will fight basically anybody, anywhere?
It's a good question. I think partly because he's very quietly spoken. He's not a brash, outspoken individual. He's not calling people out. I certainly felt like he showed a bit more personality on the microphone on Saturday. But ultimately, I think it's because we still don't really know exactly what to expect from him. We all feel like he's got more to show. We all feel like he's still got a lot of areas in his game he can develop. We know he's an amazing athlete. He can punch moving backwards on one foot with his eyes closed, crossing his arms over when he's hitting Patrick Cummins, and pivoting off the lead foot when he knocked out Shogun. There are lots of things in his game that show us that he's very talented. But I just kind of feel like he's missing the glue that holds it together, which is the aggression to push forward and make it happen. And I think he paid for that at the weekend with that knockdown. He allowed Tyson Pedro to dictate the pace early. And I think he was fortunate that he was fighting a young prospect that's maybe not got the pedigree to control his emotions in the fight. Pedro came out dancing, like his girlfriend and Taito Ivasa and the whole crew were right next to us at the commentary booth, and they were all up on their feet dancing, and it was a bit more of a nightclub atmosphere, to be honest. And OSP was there meaning business. He got caught cold early. But I think that OSP will see himself, if he watches the fight back, that if he just puts it on people, he's devastating. He's absolutely devastating.
Taito Ivasa, by the way, doing more shoeys than any person can be medically advised to do. I'm at the point now where his next fight, they're going to start with a shoey, like between rounds with water at this point. That's how much he does the shoey. But let's get back to Tyson Pedro. Say again?
Sponsored by Monster Energy drinks.
You know what? Who could blame him? It works. People love it. I love it too. So here's my question about Tyson Pedro. He came out with those question mark kicks. They were beautiful. They looked phenomenal. And then he, as you mentioned, dropped him with that right hand. And then he clinched with him. Is that inexperience you're talking about? He's clearly a good athlete. And clearly he's a good striker. And clearly it was true that training with Brandon Gibson and those folks at the BMF Ranch have done worlds of good for him. But the clinching, I just didn't understand.
Well, interestingly, a part of me expected it a little bit. When I interviewed him earlier in the week, he talked a lot about the Corey Anderson fight, which, as we know, Anderson tied OSP up against the fence and probably won the first 2 rounds by stifling him and beating him up in the clinch until obviously he got starched with that head kick. And I think Tyson looked at OSP and thought, well, I know he did. He's a big, strong, powerful athlete. The earlier rounds are going to be the most dangerous because he's most unpredictable and fastest in those rounds. So probably tie him up against the fence for a round or 2 and wear him out, and then start to use that, the speed advantage that he probably had, given the fact that he was a lighter fighter. He would have been able to maintain that into the later rounds. But I think emotion got the better of him. he was a little overeager to get the fight going, and I don't think he meant to go for the takedown. And I think well, the other thing as well, he clamped onto the guillotine, and if you look at the difference between Ilia Latifi and OSP, there's like a 6-inch height difference. So you clamp a guillotine onto Latifi, and you can lift him off the feet and make that guillotine work. But OSP still had his toes on the ground. You know what I mean? It was a lack of adaptability, I would say, and he just got a bit carried away with the moment. He went for the takedown when he really didn't need to. He should have stuck to his game plan and stayed clinched up against the fence and dirty boxed a bit.
I still have high hopes for him. I just also think he's young, and he'll get better over time. People were asking me about this gentleman, and one of the problems with my jobs and the hours that I work is I just don't have the time to focus in on prospects like I used to. But all I heard in the week up to the Singapore event, Dan, was Peter Yan, Peter Yan, Peter Yan. And so I decided to remain agnostic about it to the extent that I could. And then I watched him. Oh my God. Oh my God. I was blown away by Song Yadong, and we'll get to him in a minute. But Peter Yan, whoa. They don't come much better than that. Tell me, how impressed were you with that guy?
I was incredibly impressed. He was one of my picks for performance of the night, especially making his UFC debut, because he's still an unknown commodity. And I think he got the perfect opponent with Ishihara. Ishihara is going to be moving laterally and throwing single big power shots because he knows he's got fast knockout power, particularly in the first couple of minutes of a fight. But if you watch Yan's fights, he's so good at pressuring people. And he reminds me a lot in his attitude and in his approach to Justin Gaethje. But if you replace Justin Gaethje's wrestling and reckless boxing with really nicely polished Muay Thai, that he's very good at delivering from both stances. You go back and watch his Magomedov fights, and you'll see it. He cuts people down. He paints them into a corner, switching stances. And at the same time, he's constantly rolling underneath and landing nice, short combinations and chopping into them with kicks and knees. He's a very, very talented fighter, and he didn't look at all out of place and uncomfortable in the fight. Even when Ishihara had the run of the octagon and had all the movement he wanted, you could still see that Yan just knew it was a matter of time before he caught him.
How much is Yan's stance switching a product of his talent, and how much of that is just the new normal in MMA?
Again, it's a good question. I think it is a new precedent for mixed martial arts. I think for me, when I was fighting people of different stances, I always had a visualization. I would have one of those old top-loading cassette tapes, because I always struggled. If I was fighting an orthodox fighter, I was very comfortable because most of my opponents and training partners were orthodox. But when I had someone who was southpaw, it was almost like I had to have a second skill set, a second box of tools that I could draw upon. And then if you think that that's constantly happening in the fight, if you start to set up the right hand and then all of a sudden they switch stance, you've got to throw that out the window and start building a new attack plan up. And I think that constantly keeping somebody on the back foot, particularly in this moment of the sport where people have not become comfortable with stance switching, whether it's their own or their opponents, I think a lot of people are making the most of it. Dom Cruz always did an amazing job stance switching. Obviously, we've seen TJ Dillashaw under the coaching of Dwayne Ludwig doing it really well as well. So I do think it's a new progression in the sport. But I do think, in sort of 4 or 5 years' time, we'll have guys that are at least 60%, 40% one stance or the other, but they'll be switching most of the time.
And then Song Yadong just looking absolute. You know what he reminded me of? And the comparison won't make sense until I explain it. Mitsuhiro Ishida was predominantly a wrestler. But what I mean is, Song Yadong just has this absurd physical intensity. I mean, he physically put it on Aranches. He could do nothing it was just the pressure and like the power striking and then the control. Even when Aranches, Dan, was trying to turtle, he had to turtle slowly because everything was being held. I was so impressed by that guy. He's 20 years old? What is that kid's ceiling?
Yeah, it's absolutely terrifying. Again, another special athlete. I don't think we got a good look at him in his UFC debut because, unfortunately, I didn't feel like his opponent was really worthy of being in there with him. He just kind of couldn't keep up with him. It was nice to see him against someone that's got a lot of UFC fights under his belt like Aranches. But again, Felipe just couldn't get into the fight. Every range, Song Yadong had it covered. He's got beautiful boxing, very, very classically trained boxing, nice tight combinations, no wasted movement in anything that he does, constant pressure. very good range management as well. If you watch his fights, he manages that space between him and his opponent so well. As soon as someone, as Bruce Lee said, when my opponent expands, I contract, and when they contract, I expand. He does that almost second nature. So he's able to think about his attack instead of his footwork. It's beautiful to watch him. It really is. And I mean, we're just scratching the surface. We've not even seen what this kid's capable of yet.
Any other high performer you'd like to acknowledge here from that UFC Singapore card?
To be honest, I think the Leech looks amazing. Li Jingliang, he took on Daichi Abe, and we all kind of felt like that was going to be a stand in the center of the octagon and trade punches until someone fell over. And the Leech is a very aggressive fighter. One thing he said to me earlier in the week is that he would like to be less aggressive and more measured, and he would like to find a flow state a bit more. He would like to be a bit more reactive to his opponent. It was clear he had a game plan to beat up the lead leg of Abe. And it was clear that Abe came in there with his coaching from Dwayne Ludwig, planning on switching his stances quite regularly, which unfortunately he paid for, because no matter what leg was forward, it was getting hammered by Li Jingliang. And I mean, his confidence is at an all-time high, and that was the most measured performance we've seen of him yet. I really think the Chinese MMA fighters are on the rise, and as he kept yelling into the microphone after, China power, you know, there's definitely something special going on in that region, and we're starting to see it now.
Certainly are. What fight are you most excited about for July 6th, July 7th? So that would be the Ultimate Fighter finale, and then, of course, UFC 226. Pick your fight that you've really got your eye on.
Well, I'm in London at the moment, ready to record inside the octagon for the main event. So my entire focus is on that at the moment. I've been watching all the training footage of DC, you know, getting into his training camp and seeing how he's moving and what he's adding to his game. He has my respect for stepping up to heavyweight and taking on Miocic, but I really feel like Miocic is the most dangerous fighter that DC could fight at the moment, especially with John Jones being out, because everything that DC does well, Stipe's got a counter to it. And the things that DC does to light heavyweights is what Stipe's doing to heavyweights. I mean, you watch him against Ngannou. He DC'd him. You know, he embraced the grind. He beat him up. He dragged him to the floor. He stayed in his face. The difference with the two, obviously, is probably about, well, I would say 30 pounds difference, probably a bit less now because DC is going to have gained a bit of weight. But it's that short range power. And I mean, Miocic can throw it moving forward or moving backwards, and he needs very little space to land it. Even in ground and pound, if you watch his knockout against Alistair Overeem, I mean, he's literally moving sort of 12 inches and landing knockout power to people. So it makes it very difficult for DC moving forward and covering distance very quickly against a guy like Miocic, who obviously you've got to move past that boxing range, which we know he can knock out big, strong heavyweights. And then you get your hands on him. And although DC is a great wrestler, so is Miocic. And he only needs to wrestle enough to keep DC uncomfortable for the fight. So I'm absolutely obsessed with that one at the moment. I think it's a fascinating matchup. And I love guys stepping out of their weight class and you know, taking risks like that. So respect to DC.
Let me play devil's advocate if I can for just a moment. One thing that Cormier told me years ago was that, yes, he went to light heavyweight for Cain Velasquez reasons, and we all know those, but he loved fighting at heavyweight because he goes, they're so slow. He could just see everything coming. Now, Miocic, as you mentioned, is a great athlete, and as you mentioned, has short-range power. But what about the speed differential? Cormier is a little bit longer in the tooth as well. Phenomenal athlete, but do you think he'll have a speed advantage?
I think possibly he'll have a speed advantage, but the difference is Cormier, the majority of his punches are looping shots, and the majority of Stipe's punches are straight. And you know, a straight line's always the shortest distance between 2 points. So although DC's got to move forward, and he's going to be rolling under those punches and winging over the top, throwing that heavy body kick that he likes to use. Everything that he's doing, I mean, this is a perfect camera angle. He's walking onto this. You know, it's very, very dangerous for him. He's going to be walking into the firing range, and there's only so many times you can bob and weave to one side before Miocic starts to adjust and catches him with a hook. I really feel like if DC is going to get the win here, he needs to add something new to his game. And in the conversations I've had with DC, I don't think he's prepared to do that. I think he feels comfortable with the skill set that he's got, and I think he feels like it's enough to prove that he's the best fighter on the planet, let alone the best light heavyweight.
It feels like an eternity ago, but again, playing devil's advocate, if I may, can anything be taken if you're Cormier from Miocic's loss to Stefan Struve? And I know that's a crazy body type, and a long time ago. But I'm just wondering, is there anything?
Um, I'm not sure, to be honest. That was an unusual version of Miocic, and I mean that was a long time ago. That was my last fight, so I remember it very clearly. They were the
Wow.
main event. Yeah, I know, and that was in Nottingham as well. You see, so Miocic had to travel a long distance to. I mean, it's 5,000 miles he had to travel. Struve was hopping across the pond. It's 45 minutes from Amsterdam. It's not a very far journey, and I just think the amount of time that he would have had to adapt to someone of that kind of height, I don't think he had the time to do that. The travel, I think, was affected him as well. And I mean, let's be honest, his best performances have all been since that fight. I think that was a big wake up call for him. And there was a little bit of a stumble in that knockout as well. He wasn't turned and faced his opponent when he got punched with that clean shot. So I don't think that's well, unless DC comes in on stilts with broomsticks for arms, I don't think he's going to make much difference.
I know it's a silly question, but I had to ask because it was a time he got pushed back and stopped. So I was just thinking maybe. But very quickly, Max Holloway, Brian Ortega. Is the optimal responsibility for Ortega to get around the jab of Holloway?
Um, I think the problem ultimately with fighting Holloway for Brian Ortega is the speed in which he starts at and his aggression. You know, Brian Ortega does I mean, there's something very, very Diaz about the way he approaches fights. He's got faster hands, and I would say his boxing's tighter than the Diaz brothers. But his pace is very similar. He's kind of walk you down and beat you up with nice long range punches. Max Holloway's got a real fire in everything that he does, and again, the stance switching's a real problem. The range is going to be very different to the Frankie Edgar fight. So, you know, punches that Brian Ortega could get away with in that fight, I don't think he's going to be able to get away with Max Holloway. And I also think, you know, he's not expecting a takedown from Frankie Edgar. That's not something. He's not expecting the takedown from Max Holloway like he was against Frankie Edgar. So that's something else he can discount. So, you know, maybe Brian Ortega will look to clinch, but it's a fascinating fight. It's boxing against kickboxing ultimately, and I don't see a great deal of a ground exchange unless Max Holloway gets snapped down and Ortega clamps onto his neck. I mean, we know he's dangerous. He's got a great squeeze on him, but I think Max Holloway's a bit too wily in those ranges. I think he might be able to kind of move around Brian Ortega and beat him up from a distance.
Should Brian Ortega pull guard?
Possibly, but then the assumption is that Max Holloway is going to stay in his guard, and you know, a lot of the time, guys, you know, they end up sitting in people's guard because they feel it's a comfortable position to ground and pound from. And anybody smart that's done any research, especially someone like Max Holloway, who's adamant he's going to keep that belt, will know the risks in every range. He's a very respectful fighter, is Max Holloway, which not only tells me that he's going to do the research, he's going to do the work necessary to prepare for a particular fighter, but he's going to be able to stick to a game plan because he knows where he loses the fight. And on the grappling ranges, he loses that fight. I feel I don't think he's going to tangle there. I think his anti-grappling is good enough to stay out of guard or at least get back up to his feet if he does end up in guard.
Just a couple more questions for you, Dan. I really appreciate your time. The Israel Adesanya Brad Tavares fight. It's not, look, everything Israel Adesanya has shown us has blown me away, but nevertheless, and he is confident that this is not too much of a step up. Brad Tavares is really good, and he keeps getting better. And the problem with that is Brad Tavares is pretty good either being defensive or being resilient, and he's good everywhere. Is this too much too soon for Israel Adesanya?
To be honest, no, I don't think it is. I think he needs a high level opponent to bring the best out of him. You see him fighting guys that he feels comfortable to handle, like was it his debut against Rob Wilkinson? Mm-hmm. He looked so comfortable in that fight. It was almost like he was a little bored. He was kind of playing with him a little bit. Whereas you step in against Brad Tavares, who's had so many fights in the UFC, who's fought some of the best, he'll have Adesanya's respect. So Adesanya will be on his best behavior and he'll be putting his best foot forward. And the other thing, you look at the movement patterns of both fighters. Adesanya is very unpredictable. He's very long and rangy and very, very creative. And the only times really that Brad Tavares, in my opinion, has struggled in fights is when people have stepped outside the normal movement patterns. If you're standing orthodox in a solid boxing stance, throwing a jab cross and a low kick, that's when Brad Tavares does best. But when you're coming like the Bobby Knuckles fight, when you're coming from a front kick to a left hook and you're doing things unusual, that's when you get through his guard. So he's really going to have to be paying full attention to Adesanya and probably not taking too many risks in the first round. I actually feel like this is a good fight for Adesanya to really show us what he's capable of.
I think the ceiling for him is incredibly high. The question I wanted to end on was the following. I'm watching more and more UFC events, and at times we highlight it. So, for example, at UFC 222, we had talked about how many 20-year-olds were beating 30 or 40-year-olds. At UFC 225, that was also that case. And here we are again, UFC Singapore. Your guys like Song Yadong, for example, 20 years old or whatever. Is it my imagination, or is there some kind of real push out from the 20-year-olds in MMA now of the old guard, and is it accelerating?
Yeah, I think it is accelerating, and I think it will continue to gather speed until until a lot of the old guys are kind of more fighting the old guys. I think it's about time we had a masters division, to be honest, because it is getting to the stage where these young guys, and more than, I mean, it's not the technical advantage or anything like that of the younger guys. It's purely because they've grown up with mixed martial arts. They've grown up with a seamless game. It took me many, many years to go, okay, I'm striking, now I'm in the clinch, now I'm grappling. And to take all of those seams out and start blending it together, that's what we're seeing from these young guys. I mean, like, I've had guys that are in the UFC now that come up to me and they say, the thing that inspired me to get into MMA was your fight with GSP. I'm like, that was 2010. Like, you'd not even started training until then. But I forget, they've had 8 years to put that together. If you start training MMA in 2010 and you're watching the likes of Joyce St. Pierre and Jose Aldo and then John Jones and Conor McGregor, and you're learning from the best as you're learning your game, and you don't have all those bad habits. I spent years and years and years doing mid block, high block, you know what I mean? Front kick, learning to count to 50 in Korean and that kind of stuff. These kids aren't doing that now. They're getting in there on the mat and they're only learning stuff that's sport specific. And that's why we're seeing such seamless transitions in their game. I mean, Song Yadong is a great example. Is he an MMA fighter? Is he a boxer? Is he a kickboxer? Is he a wrestler? He's everything. He's all of them because he's a mixed martial artist. But then you look at Felipe Aranches, he's a jiu-jitsu player with some striking skills. You can still see the seam in his game. So when you start to erase those seams, that's when the decision-making is so much quicker. They're so fluid in their transitions that the older guys, we don't think quite as quickly.
Dan, are you still eyeing a comeback?
Always. Always. Absolutely. Yeah. I sit octagon side and I watch these guys all the time and I think to myself, more than anything, because I watch my old fights and I see those seams in my old fights and I'm like, I make so many mistakes. I was too heavy in my UFC career. I was talking to my old striking and my old strength and conditioning coach the other day about this. When I was fighting at welterweight, I was starting training camp at 210. I'm walking around at 180 now, and I would probably still fight at 170. I could make 55 if I wanted to, but at 180, I feel like I move like a flyweight. I can kick people in the head, no problem, with my lead leg without thinking about it. Before, I was more interested in deadlifting 500 pounds because Anthony Johnson might be standing across from me. You know what I mean? Like, the sport's changed, and unfortunately, I got caught up with the trend at the time, which was, be an athlete, get big and strong between training camps, boil yourself right down so you're the biggest you can be. And unfortunately, it just didn't suit my style. I mean, I'm a taekwondo guy, so speed was always my advantage. And the only thing that kept my weight down in the early part of my career was that I was fighting 15, 16 times a year. I would stay so active that there wasn't time to go gain weight and then come back down. But then when I signed with the UFC, I think my last fight was sort of April, May time. I didn't fight until October. That was the longest break I'd ever had in my MMA career. And I was right at that age where my body was ready to grow. I talk about this a lot. I mean, there are so many fighters that come to mind. Tom Duquesnoy is the one that I've been talking about with people recently. I feel like he's right at that stage where his body's ready to jump up in size. And all he needs to do is give himself 6 months off, and he'll comfortably move up a weight class. There are a lot of guys, I feel like they're really boiling themselves down to a weight class because that's the weight class they started in. So that's the weight class they feel like they should continue in. But you look at the likes of Jake Matthews, who looked incredible at the weekend as well. I can remember when he made his debut at lightweight and he looked like a boy. And I stand next to him now and I'm like, my goodness, he's bigger than me. He grows every time I see him. And I think with the shift in the sport, if you look at the welterweight division, There's a lot of lightweights there now. There are a lot of guys in the welterweight division that a few years ago probably would have been lightweights. You stand next, you stand Mike Perry or Colby Covington next to Gleison Tibau, and they're about the same size. And then you look at middleweight as well. We've got a former welterweight as the champion. Kelvin Gastelum's wrecking guys that are bigger than him because he's got the speed and the power. I think there's a shift in the sport. And, I think maybe I got caught up in the wrong time. And I'm looking back now thinking, I'm not really showing my best in the UFC. And that's the thing that keeps driving me to have one more fight, because I feel like I could give much more of a better example of what I'm capable of now.
Well, no matter what role you take on, whether it's fighter or analyst, you've been a great ambassador for the sport. I don't want to name names, Dan, but you and I both know what we're talking about. It is a crime that you were not nominated for Analyst of the Year. I cannot imagine a list that should be taken seriously with your name not on it. Thank you so much for being my first guest on this program. Thank you so much for all your calls, and I guess I'll see you around.
Absolutely, my friend. It's always good talking to you, and best of luck with the show. I'll be tuning in every week.
Thank you so much, Dan. I don't believe that, but thank you so much. There he goes. All right. Thanks to Dan Hardy. What a guy.